The NHS was the envy of the world, the gold standard for healthcare.
The NHS represents one of the best institutions that humanity has created.
A post-war society, stabler and more equitable than any Britain had ever known.
The idea that healthcare is a right for all and that it should be provided free at the point of delivery was a revolutionary one.
And I'm not an orthodox minister of health.
But today, it has slipped way down in the world ranking and is in a critical condition.
There are deaths in emergency departments, deaths in ambulances, deaths in people's homes waiting for ambulances.
I got a phone call from my midwife to apologise that the unit was going to be closed.
Suddenly I had my wife's and my unborn baby's lives in my hands.
I did feel absolutely terrified.
Jeremy Hunt says a jumbo jet load of patients die avoidably every week. The NHS takes off with unsafe staffing levels and a hole in the fuselage and half a wing missing every day.
People were leaving nursing in their droves because they're fed up of working in an underfunded, overstretched system.
This is the story of how the NHS has reached its tipping point. In 2012, Parliament passed Andrew Langley's Health and Social Care Act, which fundamentally changed the relationship between the state and the NHS in England.
Order!
Some called it the Abolition Act.
At its heart was about privatisation.
That really was the end of the National Health Service.
Democracy had been subverted, not by the people, but by government.
Healthcare in every country in the world is political to one extent or another, because of what it's about. Life and death and pain and suffering. And money.
In times of great change, we are once again looking to reshape our relationship with the state. And as ever, the NHS is central to that struggle.
You need things in the community that are stable for society to function and feel safe. And they don't feel safe. I don't feel safe.
I was brought up in the 30s, which was a very impoverished time. Lots of people were unemployed. The poor didn't really expect very much from the rest of the community. We lived in streets and we looked after each other in the streets. That was how we worked.
It was absolutely an appalling time. My father would walk with us through town and there'd be men from the war, that was the first war, who were sitting on perhaps little buggies made out of old pram wheels because they'd no legs. And they were begging and they'd wear their medals. I became a nurse because from the age of 3, I knew I wanted to be. I had a little nurse's uniform and there's a picture of me with the little boy next door, Sidney Parker. And he was about 18 months old in my doll's pram, and I'm feeding him, and that's in my nurse's uniform.
One of the strongest memories of my childhood is of the ambulance coming to the street to take away children to the fever hospital. They had scarlet fever or they had diphtheria, and they didn't come back.
3 of us had measles. Betty next door, Richard down the road, and myself, we all had measles. When I got up, I said, "Mummy, can I go and play with Richard?" She said, "No, darling, you can't. He's gone to live with Jesus." So I naturally thought that Jesus lived down the road. I thought that for a long time.
I think people, in a way, became kind of inured to it in that they didn't expect anything better, and that was one of the sad things.
My early memories were the mill girls bashing down the cobbles all arm in arm, and there'd be all the kind of fluff in their hair that they would breathe in. My father was a chemist and had a pharmacy in the poorest part of Salford. The mill girls were constantly coming to my father, and he would send them to the fruit merchant to buy lemons, because he thought it was the cure-all.
Did they not go to doctors?
They couldn't afford to go to doctors.
People who couldn't afford it didn't have a doctor. They simply made do. Some of the services were provided for by rich people. The dispensary in Leeds, for example, you had to be poor enough to go to the hospital. I went there to have my tonsils out.
If you go back to the 30s, during that period of mass unemployment and poverty and so on, there were clearly a lot of doctors who had strong social consciences and would adjust their charges according to the income and to the state and so on of the patient. But I mean, it was in that sense a grace and favour system. Class distinctions were very strong at that time. We really were a class-bound society. And at the heart of being middle class in the Britain of the 1940s and 50s was the consciousness and the pride in not being working class.
The only state support for healthcare came in 1911. An insurance scheme for workers was introduced, but the care it provided was very basic. It served only those that were employed.
We were a very lucky family. My father was never unemployed, so he was able to pay the £6 a week that Lloyd George had introduced for working men. It didn't include the wives and children, so we had to have some other sort of accommodation.
A man called the doctor's man used to knock on their doors on Friday, they were paid on Friday, and get the pennies that he owed the doctor.
Doctors didn't have formal surgeries in those days. They rented rooms. I remember going with my father to the panel doctor. It was dark. You came in straight off the street. There were benches for men in the waiting room. It was a very, very unattractive and unwelcoming place.
Through the 20s and the 30s, we couldn't go on with the private health insurance that we had. We've been through the American system of healthcare. We've seen it, and we didn't work for us.
I was born in the Blitz. I was very aware of the blackout. In fact, we had to wear Mickey Mouse gas masks.
There became, in the wartime coalition, a recognition that after the war, there would have to be a national health service.
My father was a staunch conservative, so was my mother. And I know he wasn't very happy about what happened, that the troops coming home voted for Clement Attlee. In the face of austerity, Clement Attlee was able to create a vision and persuade people that actually there is a need, since we've all come together for the war, to continue that collectivity on all sorts of fronts that are essential to our existence. And what I certainly didn't know at the time was the important changes that that government brought about for our general welfare.
As the people of Britain began digging out from among their ruins, they fixed all their energies upon one goal: a post-war society stabler and more equitable than any Britain had ever known. All parties joined.
There is a school of thought, you know, that believes that if a thing is scarce, it ought to be dear. Although it doesn't cost any more to produce it than if it were plentiful. Scarce, therefore, let's put up the price. Now, that's all right from the point of view of orthodox economics. But this isn't an orthodox government, and I'm not an orthodox Minister of Health.
Nye Bevan was a tremendous politician in the sense that he made you believe. He was one of those few politicians who were both authentic and optimistic. After everything people had been through in the war, they wanted to believe that there was a better life. And Nye Bevan was just amazing in the way he summed it up. He said, despite our economic and financial anxieties, we can do the most civilized thing in the world, which is to put the welfare of the sick above every other consideration.
The very beginnings of the idea came from a very practical problem. Welsh miners in a village in Tredegar were finding that they were getting ill, getting lung disease. They didn't have the money to individually pay for the service, and designed and came up with the idea of sharing the costs, so that if one of them got ill, then perhaps the pot would pay, the shared pot would pay. And that principle of sharing the risk of ill health is the essence of the NHS.
In July 1946, Bevan proposed to the nation a comprehensive health service financed by taxpayers and free at the point of delivery. But it was controversial right from the beginning.
It's obviously quite a job sending out the BMA plebiscite to 56,000 doctors, asking them, roughly speaking, whether they approve of Mr. Bevan's scheme.
The doctors didn't want the NHS. They didn't want to be state-controlled, but they were worried if we had an amazing system, nobody would want to go private, so they wouldn't get their private fees. And that was the reason that the BMA objected to the NHS. They thought, if we have this universal healthcare system that's amazing, then middle class and rich people will want to use it too.
We all want better health services and better health. But in organising them, let's make sure that your doctor doesn't become the state's doctor.
They waged a fierce campaign against the National Health Service, but eventually they got behind his vision. But even at the very start, there was a chink in the armour. Bevan had to agree to allow them to treat private as well as NHS patients.
The new scheme starts on July the 5th.
Every man, woman and child in this country, whatever your income, if you want to use this service, there'll be no charge for treatment.
Nye Bevan had a wonderful phrase. He said, the NHS must universalise the best, so everybody wants to use it.
In the summer of 1948, the NHS opened its doors.
When you look back on those early days, there was bunting out on the streets on the 5th of July, 1948. There were brass bands. There was a real sense of hope and optimism.
I remember when the National Health Service started the very day, because I was a senior nurse. I was told about a little boy who had been taken to the hospital with a broken leg in his daddy's wheelbarrow. And when he went out, he was proudly taken home by ambulance.
And I mean, there were stories once the NHS began of people going along with very long-standing conditions that they hadn't been able to get treatment for. I mean, there were some very poignant sights in those early weeks and months of the NHS. And a great rush of buying spectacles.
I was born in Liverpool. My mum was a cleaner. My dad was a Liverpool docker. We lived in one of the worst slums in Western Europe. I didn't know that at the time. We just called it home, basically. For my generation, this was the first time we'd had free healthcare, and it was good quality healthcare. And as a result of that, me and my brother, well, blossomed in a way that actually previous generations in my family didn't.
At the same time as Bevan made his pledge to the nation, the Austrian philosopher and economist Friedrich Hayek wrote a book, The Road to Serfdom, which developed ideas that stood in direct opposition to those that led to the NHS.
What he claimed was that any attempt by the state or by politics itself to change social outcomes is illegitimate. And that even though it might seem benign, creating the NHS or creating the welfare state or the American New Deal, it would inevitably lead to collective totalitarianism, to Stalinism, to Nazism. So he believed the state had to be rolled back.
Hayek gathered together a group of economists in the Swiss Alps, including Milton Friedman, to develop their philosophy and a plan for making it popular. They pushed a set of ideas that laid the foundation for what became known as neoliberalism. These ideas spread to both sides of the Atlantic and were to have a radical impact on society. The group named itself after the place of that first meeting, Mont Pelerin.
It really took off in 1947 with the foundation of the Mont Pelerin Society, where some of the richest people in the world, most of them Americans, people like the DuPonts and the Coors family, really exceedingly rich people, they decided to invest very heavily in creating a kind of neoliberal international through this Mont Pelerin Society, setting up think tanks which would refine and promote the ideas, buying up academic departments, winning over journalists and government advisors. And they went at it for 30 years or so, until they became the political common sense.
Britain was now on a different track, one that would lead to enormous political and social change.
Can you remember Nye Bevan resigning from the Labour government because they introduced prescription charges? And that was the start.
From the mid-50s, change just kind of really gets going. The Queen came through in her first televised broadcast, which was Christmas 1957.
That it's possible for some of you to see me today is just another example of the speed at which things are changing all around us. Because of these changes, I'm not surprised that many people feel lost and unable to decide what to hold on to and what to discard, how to take advantage of the new life without losing the best of the old.
I think materialistic objectives became part of what was wanted by a generation who'd not had that or had grown up without it. You've never had it so good. That was the phrase.
The health service in the early 70s was a wonderful place to work. People were inspired to work for it, and so they worked quite long hours for relatively little pay. I worked at a hospital called Whipps Cross Hospital, which is out in north-east London. It's a 1,000-bedded hospital, 1,000 beds, really big. The busiest casualty department in Western Europe. And essentially the point about that was that it ran itself. And its administrative structure was incredibly simple. When I say the hospital ran itself, it almost did. I mean, I can't exactly remember how many, but there must have been about 3 or 4 senior administrators. For 40 years, from its inception in 1948, the health service was the most cost-effective health service in the Western world.
An absolute integral part of the health service was a system called dual hierarchies, and decisions were taken in the Department of Health between civil servants and doctors. If they disagreed, then it was referred up. If they agreed, the decisions were taken. The combination of the civil service watching the pennies and the doctors watching the principles was a very good one.
By the 1970s, however, the optimism of the previous decades had given way to a period of economic decline and political disruption. Britain's economy was failing, unemployment was rising, and there were frequent strikes.
I left university as I was working for various trade unions and campaigning within my own community. And during that period, there was clearly concern that people's wages had been held back, and that there was the first inkling of cuts in our public services.
All those in favour, please show.
anyone interested in public policy should have is the importance of maintaining a stable and growing economy, because there is no example of a successful liberal democratic society against the background of economic failure.
Right there. Coming across the road now. Oh, yes. See ya?
Margaret Thatcher promised to move the country in a radically new direction.
A part of her, the brand was this notion of radicalism. Is that you were going to turn things upside down, you were going to do things differently.
When Mrs. Thatcher became leader of the party, she's alleged to have come into a meeting of the shadow cabinet with a copy of Friedrich Hayek's book, The Constitution of Liberty, slammed it down on the desk and said, "This is what we believe."
Isn't it a philosophy based essentially on selfishness? That is to say, the only spur, it seems, is gain.
So far as commercial activities or economic activities are concerned, we will benefit our fellow men most if we are guided solely by the striving for gain. We are then completely free how to use what we have earned.
On the campaign trail, there have been two very distinct Margaret Thatchers. One of them is our Maggie, the housewife's friend. The other is the crusading Iron Maiden, promising a radical brand of free enterprise politics.
I often think when you're going for consensus, so often it means that those who believe, as I believe, tend to give in to the left wing, and you steadily move further and further left. This word, you must use it, consensus, has reared its head. You must have a consensus. It's a word, again, you used not to use when I first came in politics. We had convictions. And we tried to persuade people that our convictions were the right ones. And it's no good having convictions unless you have the will to translate those convictions into action.
I've often wondered whether the unions would have behaved any differently if they'd known the consequences that were going to flow from everything that the winter discontent did to lead to a Tory government being elected a few months later.
A wave that we've now become really quite well accustomed to throughout this campaign.
And I can remember the expression, saying the party's over.
One of the easiest things in the world is to succumb to the temptation of believing that the state, that kind of imaginary mother figure of our age, will be able to provide for all, to protect us from all harsh reality, and to shoulder our burdens. But the mother figure can so easily end up not succoring, but suffocating. And then energy is sapped, then initiative is stifled, and then enterprise is destroyed.
After 3 decades, Hayek's ideas had finally become mainstream, and they guided Thatcher as she set out to roll back the state and privatize large parts of the public sector.
Oh, God, you're here. This'll interest you. British Gas shares. They come out in November. If you see Sid, tell him.
Having embarked on the privatization of British Gas, telecoms and parts of British Rail, the next stop was the NHS.
Margaret Thatcher was looking in the early 80s at the idea of privatising the NHS, or large chunks of it, and there was what one of the senior people in her cabinet described as a cabinet riot, which rejected the idea. But it kept creeping in.
The National Health Service is safe with us. I will go further. The National Health Service is safe only with us, because only this government will see that it is prudently managed and financed.
If Thatcher couldn't sell the NHS to the market, she would bring the market into the NHS.
The grocer's daughter asked, basically, a grocer, Roy Griffiths, if he would look at the health service. And one of the takeaway lines that he had
was that if Florence Nightingale was walking up and down the wards with her lamp, the first thing she'd be trying to find out is who's in charge.
Not enough is done on the perceptions and requirements of the patient as compared to a business operation where the service to the customer, to the patient, to the community is in fact paramount and central to the whole management activity.
General management was the concept that Roy introduced. A general manager who has the ability to coordinate the human, financial, and physical resources required to deliver effective care to patients.
What it did was it introduced, as it were, a new class within the health service, a managerial class that hadn't existed there before. The doctors were stripped of their powers, so they were no longer involved or consulted. They were told what clinics to do. They were told, how to run their wards. It was a serious blow to, their self-regard and their sense of themselves as being a liberal profession.
Why did you decide to become a doctor?
They ask you that question at medical school, and it's still very difficult to describe something that's inside you.
I became a doctor because my grandfather is actually a doctor. He worked in India, where the system is such that patients have to pay for their care. I remember that he used to give his care for free so that these patients could actually get it. But he was so proud when I became a doctor, and he was so proud that I was working in the NHS, where patients didn't have to pay for their treatment. And it was really inspiring for me to have that as an example of something to work for. And I was very excited to work for the NHS.
For me, I wanted to be useful in life, I suppose. I loved the arts, I loved creating art, but I just felt that perhaps I could be more useful. And that's very important for me as a value, I think.
When I was a junior doctor, I trained in Great Yarmouth. And I remember this wonderful community collegiate atmosphere. The porters used to have a band, and we'd go and watch the porters' band rehearse. I now find myself standing on picket lines with porters who are fighting for a minimum wage.
Worst hit in East Anglia was Essex, where 3 feet of snow brought with it the coldest temperatures this century.
Despite the service now being run by an army of new managers, the winter of 1987 saw one of the worst crises in NHS history. Funding had been constrained, and hospitals were forced to close beds and lay off staff, including midwives.
The NHS is seen as being in crisis right now, but it has had crises before. And I happened to have gone into labour on the evening when there was a shortage of midwives. And my very healthy baby in pregnancy, there was no one to deliver her. And so 24, 48 hours later, I still wasn't delivered. And so she was starved of oxygen. So there I was as a young mother in the arms of the NHS, but very short of staff, and no one to really explain to me what was happening to either me or my child. And yeah, it was a very, very difficult situation. And years later, it turned out that she was starved of oxygen to the extent that she's now 30 years old, but her mental age is about 5 or 6.
The NHS was in crisis at that time. There were endless scandals, problems. Babies weren't getting the treatment they needed. Endless demands for more money. It was seen by that government as a potential bottomless pit. And then completely out of the blue, Margaret Thatcher appeared on Panorama. To everyone's surprise, she announced not that there was going to be a review, but a review was in progress. Everyone leapt to, obviously, to produce ideas, service those ideas, service the Cabinet Committee. And I was, within the Department of Health, fairly involved in that. There really wasn't much on the table, except for this just notion of an internal market that had been developed by Alan Enthoven.
Alan Enthoven, an American defense economist, believed that the only way to meet the growing demand of patients in a modern health system was to introduce managed market competition. He adapted these ideas for the NHS in a paper commissioned by the Nuffield Trust.
The idea arose that essentially what was needed for the professions, and that's doctors and teachers and policemen and so on, was that they needed a good crack of competition.
There was a sense that money should follow the patient, so that centres that were successful were rewarded and other centres that failed went to the wall.
It was immensely controversial, hugely controversial. Probably the most controversial, certainly the most controversial piece of NHS legislation until Andrew Lansley tried to repeat the thing in more detail in 2010-2012.
One of the issues when you bring in a market is it results in maldistribution of funds, because instead of funds going into services and into the staff, what happens is that the money is diverted away.
Accountant, architect, audit clerk.
You've got the cost of billing and invoicing, marketing, and of course you've got the returns to the shareholders and the investors. We know that as soon as the government moved to bringing in a shadow market and an internal market, the administration costs doubled. They doubled overnight from 6% to 12%.
At a time when every business wants to move more quickly.
Throughout the 80s, the UK economy looked to accelerate its sluggish growth. It led to the rise of the management consultant.
So things wouldn't only speed up, but could actually jump ahead.
Someone once said that a management consultancy is someone who steals your watch and then charges you to tell the time.
Management consultancy is a dark art, or at least quite mysterious. Consultants have been key agents within the US and the UK especially in pushing forward new public management, privatisation and market-based approaches to what were previously public sector activities.
You see the consultancies who are increasingly the big four accountancy firms advising on how to change health services, then advising the participants on how to deal with those changes, then when it doesn't work out, advising on how to change it again so that it, in theory, will work. Of course it doesn't, and the cycle just goes on and on and on. But in fact, they got the best from it. They got millions, if not billions, in fees from that.
We carried out a study, one of the first ever studies, in fact, and we looked at 120 NHS trusts in England over a 4-year period and found that each one spent about £1.2 million each year on management consultancy, and there were no noticeable increases in efficiency, and in fact, they led to an increase in inefficiency in all but a minority of cases. So if you imagine 120 chief executives of NHS trusts in England being asked, what have you done with your £1.2 million in the consulting casino, very few of them would have been able to say that they came out on top.
By the end of the 90s, the Tories had overplayed their hand and no longer had the public support. But the road to privatisation of the NHS had been set in motion, and there seemed to be no turning back.
Shine, shine, it's my time. Shine, yeah, you be mine. Shine, shine, it's my time. Shine, yeah, you be mine.
One of the things that I think has changed in politics is that after, if you like, sometimes a rather crude type of collectivism of the first part of this century, and then the reaction against that in the name of free markets, we've now got a situation where people are trying to reach for a new relationship between individual and society, between citizen and state, and trying to balance how you achieve a genuine modern enterprising economy with social cohesion, with one nation politics.
In the 90s, they were very shiny, if that's a way to describe it. It was a very kind of a positive time to grow up in. And certainly I feel quite an apolitical time too. No one talked about politics or, you know, what the government were doing or what, issues of the day were. You just kind of getting on, having a nice time.
I was never really political at all. I've always been the kind of person that has just put my head down and got on with the work that I had to do. I care about other people, but I've always felt that me as a small individual couldn't do more than I was doing, and that being a doctor was the most that I could do.
I've really, like a lot of doctors, just wanted to keep my head down and do my work, be enabled to do my work. And I wasn't really political in a campaigning sense until the hospital where I work was involved with a private finance initiative contract. And I was representing the doctors around that. And I could see from the beginning that this was a bit of smoke and mirrors accounting that didn't look like a very good idea.
I went up to Skye to look at what was happening with the road bridge from the mainland to Skye that was being built, where I discovered that it was the most phenomenal rip-off of the people of Skye and the public sector there could ever be.
The bridge was a flagship private finance initiative paid for by a commercial consortium. But their tolls were 10 times what toll bridge users elsewhere in the UK were used to paying. The non-payment campaign saw hundreds of normally law-abiding people arrested, dozens getting criminal convictions, and one man ending up in jail.
While Labour was in opposition before 1997, they had pledged to bring the private finance initiative to an end because they saw that it was crazy, it was nonsensical.
When we came to power in 1997, the NHS was probably the biggest political issue. There were very long waiting lists. Survival rates for cancer, heart disease had fallen way behind the rest of Europe. There was a sense that the National Health Service had once been a great institution, but had gone into decline. So there was probably no bigger challenge for the incoming Labour government than the National Health Service.
It was underfunded, understaffed, that a lot of the hospitals were very run down.
A whole new generation of large hospitals was needed, and they couldn't be built by borrowing money because Gordon Brown had promised not to borrow money. So the private finance initiative was enlisted, and in the late 1990s, scores of new hospitals were built using this program.
The purpose of PFI, as I see it, is to bind these contractors into value for money so that they and not the public bear the cost of flaws, failures, overruns and delays.
I would freely confess to being part of the conventional groupthink that thought this is a great idea, we can have the hospitals we need, and feeling slightly irritated by the critics because they were just making trouble.
The problem with PFI, the Private Finance Initiative, is that although you get the facilities today because they're paid for by the private sector investors, the government doesn't actually have to pay for those until the future. So it's like getting a new hospital today, but the cost of that new facility is really being borne by future generations.
Calderdale Royal Hospital was the second private finance initiative hospital in the country, and it's a model that hasn't done well. The hospital was opened in about 2000. The contract with the consortium that built it is for 60 years. And come what may, the Public Health Service has to pay the rent and maintenance and all the services on that building. And it doesn't seem to be a contract that they can get out of.
Calderdale PFI Hospital comes under the same trust as neighbouring Huddersfield Royal Infirmary. With the trust being forced to make deep cuts, the publicly owned Royal Infirmary is taking the hit and facing closure.
Save Huddersfield Royal Infirmary, signed a petition. Save HRI, signed a petition, love.
Huddersfield cannot afford it. I can't afford it, you can't afford it, we can't afford it.
So has everyone got sight of the minutes and the agenda? Steve very kindly circulated minutes. Welcome to everyone, I should have said. If we take minutes and matters arising, their proposal is to shut the accident and emergency and to reduce the hospital from fully serviced hospital just to a 64-bed facility, which, to cover a population of 750,000 between Calderdale and Huddersfield, will mean that people won't get the treatment. People will actually die either in transit or even when they get to hospital because they won't be able to be accommodated.
Anybody else like to sign? 30 seconds of your time.
What they're wanting to do is centralise hospital services in the major cities, so we're all going to have to travel. Don't know if you heard about the guy that died in the back of an ambulance last night. 23 hours he was waiting for treatment. They couldn't save him.
This is another attack on our staff, on our hospital. The only reason why we're in this mess is because Calderdale took out a £98 million loan to build an extension.
I've lived here for 42 years, born and raised about 200 yards from where I'm sat now. I had my daughter at a young age, at 19, and I wanted to recreate my childhood for her. As a child, we used to run down here in the summertime and we'd flip off our shoes and we'd be sprinting and we'd run all the way down and dive into the locks. I was diagnosed with breast cancer on March the 6th, 2015. For 2 years there, I didn't know whether I would see my 41st birthday, let alone my 42nd. Everything was happening in Huddersfield, so it couldn't have been any more convenient.
The ward was going to be closing down. We knew Grandma didn't have long left and we was given a side room. They told us that they might need to come in and start taking things down. And I said, I don't think so. I'd barricade this room before you come in and take things off the wall. There was lots of drilling and noise. And then the ward closed the weekend before she died with a sickness bug. Looking back, I don't actually think there was a sickness bug. I think that was the start of getting patients out to Calderdale.
It would be drastic for this community if Huddersfield Royal Infirmary were to go. It's like we're having the carpet pulled from underneath us. You need stability, you need things in the community that are stable for society to function and feel safe, and they don't feel safe. I don't feel safe.
Huddersfield is just one of many public hospitals across the country, bearing the brunt of cuts due to enormous debts of PFI hospitals.
We will be getting, within the health service, about £11 billion worth of infrastructure, for which we will be paying £80 billion over the life of those contracts.
Looking back, you realise that at the time there was this advancing wave of neoliberal thought, that markets were the way of doing things, that the private sector was better than the public sector.
Possibly as a government, we were over-optimistic about the benefits of PFI. But I think it's important today not to then downplay what it actually achieved. I mean, we renewed the hospital infrastructure of the country through PFI. It probably wouldn't have been done otherwise.
And it then takes years of things starting to go wrong and the deficiencies in that way of thinking about the world being exposed that you realise, no, there must be a better way of doing this, and start to re-examine why some of the changes that seemed inevitable at the time came about and how they can be reversed. And I think that's what's happening around the NHS at the moment.
I've been researching the NHS since 1988, 89.
In here? Great. I think we've been in here before.
All the evidence shows that you can't deliver universal healthcare through a market.
Do you want a pudding? Would you like a pudding?
Markets result in risk selection and actually rendering the people who don't get care, the poor, the old, people with disabilities, invisible.
I'd previously been sensitised to the issue with my surgery that I was a patient at in Camden, which was taken over by United Health about 10 years ago. And that surgery no longer exists now. So I was shocked at that occurrence, because there'd been nothing about it on the news or anything that I'd seen.
We promised in the 1997 general election to abolish the internal market, and as far as I was concerned, one of my jobs as the health secretary and a Democrat was to implement all the things that we'd promised to do. But then, for reasons I don't really understand, the Prime Minister and others started pushing, and Alan Milburn giving way to the idea of franchising stuff out to the private sector.
We wanted to reduce waiting lists. We found in the end that if we introduced new providers in the health care system, people still got the healthcare and their operations free at the point of use. But we introduced providers who were prepared to do it faster.
If Virgin have a different idea about how to provide care, provided they deliver what they're contracted to deliver in terms of outcomes, that's what matters.
People talk about, well, it's all about improving outcomes. Everybody wants to improve outcomes. If Virgin can give you a good outcome for your operation, end of story. But what about this person? No, it's, we're all in this together. Everybody, that's the whole idea of the NHS, that everybody is covered.
Nobody believes that they will wake up one morning and not be able to get the care that they need, even though they find that services are already disappearing.
NHS nurses, NHS buildings, but for the first time in Britain, a district general hospital with private enterprise at its very heart. Hinchingbrook in Cambridgeshire faced closure, but from February the stock market listed company Circle will run the hospital.
The essence of how you run a private hospital is you get quite a lot of consultants, and the proposition is that they bring in business. It did kind of forget the fact that it's an NHS hospital and it's got an accident emergency department and it trains people and it's got a whole load of other junior staff.
There's no two ways about it. This is a bad day for the government as far as the health service is concerned. First of all came the news that Circle was pulling out of Hinchingbrook, which plays right into the hands of those who'd warned that the private sector should not be involved in the NHS.
I was asked to come and be the chairman of a hospital in a fair amount of distress, really, for want of a better word. On the first day I walked in the door, I stood there and I thought, well, the car parks work. Well, I know where the front door is, it's pretty obvious. There's a reception desk here that's pretty well staffed by people who know what they're talking about. Feels like a hospital. But it just kind of lost its soul.
The hospitals in Holland are public-based with two exceptions, and those exceptions went bankrupt today. Yeah. I think that tendency towards more privately owned institutions needs to be stopped, because private institutions are going for low-risk, high-profit parts of the healthcare system.
Hinchingbrook had a lot of long-standing staff who'd been members of there for a long, long time. And I think they felt that as part of that whole exercise of managing it by Circle, they had become less valued, and therefore they behaved in a less valued way. So some of the sense of service and selflessness and so on disappeared.
The collapse of Lehman Brothers set off a wave of panic on Wall Street.
Financial giants Merrill Lynch and Lehman Brothers buckled under the real estate and credit crisis.
Many have seen nothing like it in their lives. None have seen anything like it in their careers.
The times, they are a-changing. In praise of our Nobel laureate today, Bob Dylan. And in this country, they've been changing too.
The plan
by the NHS in 2008, 2009, when they saw the global financial crisis coming, and NHS hierarchy immediately knew what was going to come in the next few years, which is a squeeze on public spending. That's how it's always been.
The whole world now realizes that the huge overhang of debt means that the recovery will take longer and be harder than had been hoped.
When that plan was formulated, I certainly don't think that NHS management and ministers thought it's going to go on for 10 years.
In the face of recession and austerity, in 2011, Health Secretary Andrew Lansley introduced the hugely controversial Health and Social Care Bill, a piece of legislation that was seen by many as taking the NHS onto the final stretch to privatisation. What Thatcher had started was now getting closer to completion.
It's one of the endearing characteristics of the British that they think that it's necessary to produce 3 acts of Parliament over a period of 12 years, all doing precisely the same thing, which was Ken Clarke's Act of 1990. Alan Milburn's reforms of 2000 and Lansley in 2012.
Lansley went a step further and introduced a fundamental change to the NHS. He took away the Secretary of State's ultimate responsibility to provide a national health service for all.
I've said before that I call this bill the abdication of the Secretary of State bill. He wishes to take the NHS out of politics.
He was a very single-minded, determined man who formulated a really detailed blueprint. It was his own blueprint. It wasn't policy wonks, think tanks. It was his.
How are you? Nice to see you. Hi there. Hi there. Good to meet you. Nice to meet you. Hi, Joe. Good to see you.
The coalition government coming in 2010, it were planning enormous changes to the NHS. For 7 years, Lansley was Shadow Health Secretary, cooking up these plans. But the one thing they didn't want to do was have a public debate about them.
Both our parties have given their full backing to our coalition agreement, a Liberal Democrat Conservative government that we have negotiated.
There had to be a marriage between the Conservatives' manifesto and the Liberal Democrat one. Now, that was undertaken in number 10 Downing Street over 12 days in one hell of a rush, with most ministers not consulted. They stuck these two manifestos together in a shotgun marriage. And when these two were put together, what came out was something that everybody who knew anything about it regarded as completely unworkable and crazy.
Behind the scenes, David Cameron's been frustrated by the Health Secretary, Andrew Lansley, who's steeped in NHS jargon and has been reluctant to redraft a plan he thinks will work. Andrew Lansley worries that Nick Clegg is trying to distance himself from reforms he used to champion. How much of those reforms the government keeps pushing on with, we find out in 2 months' time.
Well, the Lib Dems were in a very strange position because, of course, they were in coalition government, so it was their white paper too.
We were, as a party, opposed to the whole idea of the bill, which at its heart was about privatisation.
What we saw under the Cameron coalition government was a piece of legislation, the 2012 Health and Social Care Act, which, as a matter of ideology, insisted that NHS services should be subject to competitive tender and so to the provision of the service by private companies.
There was this huge political row about it all.
The word upset's not right. I don't get upset. I wasn't upset. I was completely opposed to it. You haven't got time to be upset if you're a politician. You've got to take a position and stand and then deal with that.
We are making a statutory obligation in this bill to deliver a more equal outcome on the NHS, which they failed to deliver in 13 years.
Isn't it time to do what they said they would do at the start? Listen to doctors and nurses and drop this bill.
He's taking a totally opportunistic position in opposition to this bill.
There's no good, by the way, the Deputy Prime Minister's smirking. I mean, I don't know whether he supports the bill or opposes it. Which day of the week? You support it? Oh, you support it?
There was a very big debate about the Health and Social Care Act. And so bad was it that Cameron called a halt and they had a pause.
I can therefore tell the House that we propose to take the opportunity of a natural break in the passage of the bill to pause, to listen and to engage with all those who want the NHS to succeed
I'm a doctor of 30 years, Mr. Lansley. Explain to me how this is going to make patients better, because nobody understands your bill. It's got 1,000 amendments because it was so poorly drafted.
I worked closely with Shirley Williams when she was conducting a valiant rearguard action in the Lords.
We put together a team, some of our best members of Parliament, and that team then worked through the details of an extremely complex, very long bill, so that they could put down hundreds of amendments, which would therefore gradually change the nature of the bill.
There were 2,000 amendments, but actually an awful lot of those were just technical, changing names and things that they went through. The substantive amendments were probably 4 or 5.
While the government was committed to listening to public concerns, behind the scenes, it was a different story. In the back streets of Westminster, lobbyists and the Independent Healthcare Providers Network, representing healthcare companies like Virgin, Circle and United Health, were talking to Lansley's team and Number 10 to try and make sure that the plans for privatisation contained in the bill stayed on track.
I looked at some of the think tanks. These are organisations in the UK and they surround Westminster. And they call themselves think tanks, but often what they are is business lobby groups. Lobbyists have become embedded in policy making over a series of decades. And it is extremely problematic. One of the oldest of these is the Institute of Economic Affairs, which was set up in the 1950s by a member of the Mont Pelerin Society and has been a central part of this neoliberal free market movement ever since. Both the institutions and their staff are really well connected in government circles. So if you take Reform, which is another of these free market think tanks pushing NHS privatisation, its deputy director, Nick Seddon, was an ex-private healthcare lobbyist who then lobbies for NHS privatisation at Reform and then sails into a job in Number 10 where he sets about writing NHS policy.
Much of the political change happens at arm's length from the public, and so when the impact of that change is realised, it can often be quite a long way down the line when things have reached an advanced stage, policy ideas have been adopted into law, and it's kind of too late.
How many times do you think the word competition appears in your health and social care bill, the version I have? I know there have been 17 versions since, but this one. How many times do you think the word competition appears? 86. How many times do you think the word cooperation appears?
Oh, it appears.
Naught.
Lord Acton once says, all power corrupts. Absolute power corrupts absolutely. But actually, years of impotence can corrupt as well. And the power that the Lib Dems suddenly find themselves having, I think, was deeply corrupting.
I believe that the government has moved a very long way, and in particular, I think because of the minister, we have moved a very long way.
My right honourable friend, together with Baroness Shirley Williams, was explaining to their Liberal Democrat colleagues some of the amendments which we have been working together on in order to make sure there is further reassurance. That is literally true.
I did everything I absolutely could within the party to get them to abandon their support for it.
And I believe that that combination of changes will actually enable us to bring about an improved NHS. Now, I may prove wrong. I freely accept I may prove wrong.
One of the most extraordinary stories is the ultimate support of the Lib Dems for the Health and Social Care Act. They were essential to it getting through.
Once the leader of the party, the Deputy Prime Minister's, signed up to something, it takes a huge amount of energy and courage to oppose that.
Order! Order!
I supported the ultimate bill because of the big changes, but the changes were such as to actually change the nature of the bill. One of the things that became very clear was that access to private health continued to be small, limited, and very much under control.
On the day she sent out a letter co-signed with Nick Clegg saying, "We've got this bill as good as it can be," I resigned.
The ayes to the right, 328. The noes to the left, 246.
So the ayes have it. The ayes have it.
Over 200 MPs and peers had interests, either current or recent, in private healthcare. So it was absolutely shocking that the people who were voting on the Health and Social Care Bill, which was really going to open up the health service to the private sector, were involved in companies which stood to benefit from that legislation. And one of the unions just said, are these people private? Are they public servants or are they private servants?
Unfortunately, that pause only resulted in the government actually galvanising and creating momentum to drive that bill through Parliament. And the most unfortunate thing was that the Royal Colleges were largely silent, as was the British Medical Association.
The government is very careful, all governments, Labour or Conservative, I've done it myself. You woo them, knighthood here, Damon there, keep them on track and give them some money, more money for their research, and you all the time are actually undermining their independence.
Democracy had been subverted, not by the people, but by government. There's a phrase I've got which is, it's the power of the people versus the people in power.
I met Jeremy Hunt when he first came in. I went all the way up to Westminster to meet him. It's a true story. And I got inside the Department of Health and I needed to use the gents. And I was feeling slightly anxious about meeting him because, you're meeting a new health secretary. And I was squatting down in the toilet in the Department of Health and there was a bit of graffiti at eye level and it said, there are 2,000 people working in the Department of Health. At this precise moment, you're the only one who knows what he's doing. I meet Jeremy Hunt and he says to me, when I open the bonnet on Andrew Lansley's reforms, I'm pretty impressed with what I see. And I went, ha, 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 thinking it was a joke, and it wasn't.
Although it appeared to be business as usual at Number 10, the fallout of the 2012 Act had significantly altered the responsibilities of the Secretary of Health.
The Health and Social Care Act in 2012 severed the duty of the Secretary of State to provide universal services throughout England. And that really was the end of the National Health Service when that duty was severed and the Secretary of State or the Minister now had abdicated responsibility.
The next stop on their journey to privatisation was to transfer control of the NHS to new management. Leading these changes is a man few have heard of.
Simon Stephen, who's the chief executive, spent 10 years in United Health in the United States, knows the American healthcare system extremely well.
He was the architect of Labour's reforms, marketisation reforms. Then he goes off to America and he learns how they do it over there. And he gets the contacts and the insider knowledge of how the system works there. And then he brings that experience and he starts to implement it in this country.
Stevens set about dividing the National Health Service into smaller regional systems. Public or private contractors will then be put in control of these mini-systems for periods of 10 to 15 years. It is they who will decide which services will be available on the NHS, who will provide them, and which local services will be cut.
By doing that, you therefore allow other organisations to have responsibility. And it is only in that way that you can truly move towards a private involvement where the buck does not stop with the Secretary of Health, but stops with the private organisation. So they therefore become responsible for the care.
We're looking at an engine, essentially, which forces contracts into the market, and a proportion of those will go to the private sector. In the last year, roughly 43% went to the private sector.
So this was rather like a repeat of the private finance initiative, where the government was rolling up hundreds of millions of pounds worth of projects and awarding them for periods of 30 years and more. But the difference with these contracts is that they were for all the clinical care.
One of the big winners was Virgin. They won over £1 billion worth of NHS work in the last year.
If you look underneath most of the changes that are taking place at the moment, it's preparing the NHS slowly, steadily, and surreptitiously for the United States healthcare system.
Improved well-being at home can reduce hospital visits, but if something does go wrong, we have the technology, like virtual doctor visits. What happened to you?
Last year, our daughter was in a coma for 2 weeks. It did occur to me about a week in, watching her with her tubes and her 11 drips, that by this time, in America, I'd be thinking of remortgaging the house. So that's what the NHS means to me.
In America, 61 million people, 1 in 5 go without health care. They have no insurance for coverage. 2/3 of all medical bankruptcies are thought to be due to health care bills. America spends more on health care than any other country, and yet it ranks last for many outcomes. If England is seeking to reform its system, it could look to a European country for ideas, which tend to spend more than the UK and get better results.
Holland is famous for having one of the best healthcare systems. All people in Holland have access to healthcare insurance, and it's a mandatory insurance, but the rates are that low that everyone can afford it. The government helps people who can't afford it to still access the insurance. I think that we have to keep in mind that we are talking about patients. And it doesn't really matter from that point of view if someone's living in Holland or in the US or in the UK. The systems, the legislation is there to provide great accessibility for people to healthcare. And I think we need to stand up for that.
The NHS works best when all its different parts, from A&E to community health, work together. But these relationships have been damaged by the fragmentation of the service, brought about by endless reorganisation, privatisation and cuts.
My main work has been around children with disability. I knew that what really made an impact for the child and the family was how the teamwork around that child and family was going to help them change their life and achieve their potential. And indeed, we built a centre in Lewisham where that ethos could be living, working in the same building.
I've struggled with depression for a very long time, since I was a teenager. I'd been to see my GP, and in a 10-minute appointment, they gave me some antidepressants and they didn't help. I ended up getting to the point where I was suicidal. So I ended up admitting myself to A&E.
If children in mental health distress, for example, self-harming, were in the A&E, there'd be a rapid call-out abilities for a mental health professional to see them from the same community, from the same area, and then organise the next urgent contact once they've left hospital, so there's immediate continuity.
The average person doesn't understand the consequences of the Health and Social Care Act 2012 because it's very abstract. What does it mean when you say you've removed the duty to provide? But the way it's being expressed is through the major cuts and closures and reductions in care.
What was significant about the Lansley Act is the downgrading of hospitals, closing units that were close to the community.
In 2012, without any consultation with staff, plans were made to close several units at Lewisham Hospital, including the accident and emergency.
If the hospital closed down and the child was going to a different A&E, out of area, different social services, different mental health services, you've utterly destroyed that partnership working that took so long to build up.
They were trying to see whether they could let me go because there wasn't the space. still to keep me. They were asking whether they thought I would be able to be treated at home or whether I should go to hospital. And by this point, I knew I wasn't safe to leave. So I asked to stay. After 3 days being there, at about 1 a.m, an ambulance came to take me away. I felt very, very isolated and alone, and I ended up arriving at a psychiatric hospital in Harrow at about 3 a.m.
We're seeing a huge increase in childhood suicide, self-harming, and there are situations now where the community child and adolescent mental health service is just not there for children.
We are at a time in the NHS which is really very, very troubling. And I think that it's extremely difficult because it's one thing being a doctor, working in teams, which of course you have to do, and trying to avoid mistakes. And it's another thing working as a doctor in teams in the NHS trying to avoid mistakes, but there being systemic, huge problems.
Becky was always a very delightful child, very happy, When she went to school, she got bullied. And then she changed. She became very withdrawn, anxious over everything. She worried. As the bullying got worse, she started self-harming. She was 12, but the GP said because of her age, they couldn't actually do anything. And eventually she started trying to commit suicide.
She was admitted to a hospital in mental health crisis. The nearest place was 80 miles away from her home.
I knew she'd be away for a long time. And when she came back in a month,
They discharged her because they had to have the bed. She couldn't have the bed anymore. So they discharged her and she was so unsafe.
She had no contact with mental health services after discharge. And about 2 weeks later, she actually committed suicide.
the inquest said there was a lot of failings. She didn't get the help that she wanted.
It was as if they were doing it from a script and it had to go that way, and that was it.
So you felt dismissed?
Yeah, very dismissed.
The coroner's inquest found that the cause of death was accidental death due to neglect, which was caused by the lack of NHS services for community mental health service. And for me, that's just one example that sums it all up.
It's absolutely devastating to see it going the way it is, to witness patients suffering, dying, because of changes that could be made very easily if the government decided to make them.
My mother was falsely accused of a parking offence. She wasn't going to have it, and she decided to defend herself, unheard of. So she goes to court, and she won. And she did it on the basis that the police officer, constable, had overlooked something rather important, that there was somebody in the car. And the person in the car was my father. He was disabled from the First World War. And my mother was acquitted. From that moment onwards, she said, well, if they will do that to me over parking, what are they doing for the rest of the population over all sorts of things? And from that moment onwards, she kind of influenced an approach to authority, which was, you know, you just got to ask questions. Don't take it. If it's not true, don't take it.
While our hospitals are working hard Monday to Friday to get patients better, sometimes it can feel as though Saturdays and Sundays are more about just somehow getting through to Monday. By sticking to the plan, we can and will achieve this together. A 7-day NHS safe in our hands for every generation to come. Thank you.
Until the junior doctor's contracting position, I didn't have a political bone in my body.
the junior doctor's contract was based on the premise of this truly seven-day NHS that David Cameron talked about in his election manifesto. There is no funding, there is no plan, there is no model. You cannot stretch an already understaffed NHS to 7 days without staff, without funding.
I became an activist when Jeremy Hunt came out in the media and essentially assigned blame to doctors for patients dying at the weekend. I couldn't believe it. I couldn't believe that he would make that kind of allegation.
We've had now 8 studies in the last 5 years that have said mortality rates are higher at weekends. Do we just say, well, we're going to forget about those vulnerable patients, we're not going to make the changes necessary to have a 7-day NHS?
Jeremy Hunt says, you know, a jumbo jet load of patients die avoidably every week. Well, yes, because you haven't safely staffed the NHS. He keeps comparing the NHS to the airline industry. Well, it's like the airline industry in the sense that, you know, you're sitting on a plane, you're a pilot down, you've got half the crew missing, you've got a hole in the fuselage, you've got half the wing missing, and yet you still have to take off. The staffing levels in most hospitals, an airline would say, we can't take off, it's not safe to take off. The NHS takes off with unsafe staffing levels and a hole in the fuselage and half a wing missing every day.
People were leaving nursing in their droves because they're fed up of working in an underfunded, overstretched system and not being properly valued for the work that they do.
A hospital is a place where you look after the staff, because if you look after the staff, the patients will get looked after.
I think at the moment, the NHS, and it is of recent years, has become a very difficult place to work in. It's become a place where, as doctors and nurses, we're expected to be mere cogs in an enormous wheel. We're expected to treat consumers rather than patients who don't go to hospitals anymore, they go to treatment units.
Every trust, every worker, every output is measured and under surveillance with targets. If you don't meet the targets, you fail. This puts the health workers in a terrible position, and it leads to burnout, people leaving their jobs, people not coping, and a high degree of mental illness in the workforce.
We're killing the very people that we asked to care for us. And I think that was at the heart of the junior doctors' dispute, is that the mental distress caused by the working conditions in the NHS make them impossible to work in.
No one wants to have a contract forced upon them, and actually 58% of doctors voted against it.
Never in a million years would you get junior doctors taking the hardest decision of their life and leaving the hospital. That was incredibly difficult.
We decided to take Jeremy Hunt to court as one of the many ways in which we were protesting against the contract imposition. We felt that what he was doing was unjustified, and we felt that what he was doing was unlawful. It was a protest against the contract, and it was also a message that politicians cannot just do what they like and get away with it.
When people are threatened, they will come together. And if there's this degree of insecurity, and it seems to be increasingly the case, especially for younger people, that could actually, in the context of insecurity, both material and psychological, lead to a greater coming together and awareness of the need for collective provision, of which the single most important provision is healthcare.
We're standing outside the Royal Courts of Justice in London this morning. We're about to go in for the hearing into our judicial review case that we're bringing against NHS England and the Secretary of State.
Here's me, a happily retired apparatchik, taking the government to court about the 2012 Health and Care Act. I'd never have thought I'd be doing this. It was never on my bucket list. But I'm determined they won't get away with it.
Instead of people now being able to go through their community health councils and having a right to go to the Secretary of State automatically, that right has been really removed and weakened so that people have to go to the courts, and this is a shocking state of affairs when you have to go through to the courts to remedy the fact that your right to health and your entitlements have been so eroded.
We've got to this point probably before other campaign groups because our trust went early in terms of the closure programme, but also because we've been successful in getting the politicians to act and to get as far as a judicial review. It costs money.
We get lots of support from local people.
That's the difference between this campaign and anything I've seen in Huddersfield before. Yeah. The number of people in all areas and all communities across the town. It's massive. It's different from any kind of movement I've seen before.
They're all just like us normal people that care and want to fight for an institution that were given to us a long, long time ago.
All the campaign groups are looking at us and saying, you've got to defeat this because we're coming up behind you.
I hadn't gone around fighting for the NHS, but it really began with the citizenry of Lewisham. The people of Lewisham did what my mother did to Jeremy Hunt. What are you doing, shutting this hospital? Or at least downgrading it to such an extent that it was really a shell of its former self. And it wasn't going to provide the A&E, it wasn't going to provide maternity, all the things that matter to the community.
Less than a year that we were actually paid homage to the NHS at the Olympics, and then here we are, less than 8 months later, the government is saying they want to cut Lewisham, A&E and mums and babies. So we're here to protest to say, no, that wasn't the legacy of the Olympics, so that's why we're here protesting.
Can we take health out of politics? My answer to that question is a resounding no. The delivery of good quality public services, including the National Health Service, is at the very heart of what politics is about, because it's about social justice.
The idea that healthcare is a right for all and that it should be provided free at the point of delivery, it was a revolutionary one. The principles upon which it was built is not the problem. The way it has been run and the values that have driven those decisions, that is what the problem is. And that is why the NHS may not work as well as we'd want it to nowadays.
The public still believe in their NHS. They want their NHS, but it's the politicians that they have decided that we can't afford it.
You will, by definition, you will have a two-tier health system if the National Health Service is not being properly reformed and not being properly funded. Because in the end, if people who can afford to pay for their healthcare don't get a decent service from the NHS, they will go outside.
How much more are we prepared to pay to support a service that we really want? There's various public polling again on whether people are willing to pay tax, and they may say they love the NHS, but are they willing to dip into their pockets to pay the tax to support the service that they would like?
It was my sister who finally said, when she saw this rather swollen left arm, she said, "You go to the doctor immediately." And she just took one look at me and she freaked out. She said, "You've got a metastasized cancer." She immediately booked me into UCH. And the first chemo I had was absolutely catastrophic. It was a bit like I had been thrown off a mountaintop and then doused in napalm. So when I was finally let out of hospital and went to see the oncologist, I said to him, "I'm not going there again." And he said, "Okay, well, we'll see if we can try another chemo that is more expensive, so we'll have to get it authorized." Within 4 weeks, the tumor that was on the liver, that was this size, it was absolutely vast, had halved. Now we're going to just put you on the 2 targeted drugs for this particular cancer, and you'll be on these drugs every 4 weeks till the end of your life. I said, well, you know, what is the end of my life? Oh, well, you know, a few months. I am still on those drugs, which are very expensive, 4 years on.
My guess would be, over the next 30 years, we could probably double the share of spending on the NHS, so from 7 to 14% of GDP, and we would love it.
It's very important people don't have to worry not only about getting ill, but about the financial consequences of getting ill. And it's worth fighting for. We absolutely have to fight for it.
I am standing for the BMA, so that's the British Medical Association, our union. We need to start changing these institutions. It'll take time, and I don't know if it's possible, but it's worth a try.
I became very active within the union. I was elected onto the National Junior Doctors Committee because I saw that the only way you have a voice is through a collective organisation. And I very much saw that the decimation of our working terms and conditions was fundamentally linked to the wider decimation of the NHS.
Democracy for me is being voted by the people that you want to represent, that you want to help in the community that you live in.
The future seems a peculiarly blank page, and that's perennially true. Even so, that kind of feels right at the moment.
It hinges really on what we want. It's not a case of the NHS suddenly crumbling into dust in the next few years. If we don't want it to, it won't. If we don't care, it will.
Things are changing all around us. I'm not surprised that many people feel lost and unable to decide what to hold on to and what to discard. How to take advantage of the new life without losing the best of the old.
We're coming up to another kind of moment, decisive sort of shift in the pendulum. We'll be back towards greater social solidarity, getting the balance kind of a bit more appropriate between, as it were, liberty on the one hand and equity on the other. It's not a dog-eat-dog society that we want. We want a society that looks after everyone.
Inviting me fingernails again. We've won!
Despite our economic and financial anxieties, we can do the most civilized thing in the world, which is to put the welfare of the sick above every other consideration.